Not great, we see issues already. Hello, hello. Today we are breaking the myth, we are torturing it out of existence in a way. And the myth here that we're looking at is the suffering artist and the way it has permeated through the ages. Trigger warning. This video addresses sensitive topics related to mental health and self-destructive behaviors. Viewer discretion is advised. The suffering artist, the struggling artist, the tortured artist, the recluse in the woods focusing on their craft. This is a stereotype and it lives under the guise of many names. Yet, it can all be stripped down to the same idea. And that idea is that you need to suffer for your artwork. And if you suffer for it, well, at least you get rewarded because after you die, it may be heavily celebrated. But apart from that, this obsession with the suffering artist is really visible in the Western world, and especially if we consider media. For example, we can see that artists in general, actors, poets, writers, whatever it may be, they are looked through this lens of scrutiny and they're completely deprived of any privacy. We see this when headlines come out spewed over our computer screens or phones and they read that this genius person, this renowned artist has died after a struggle with alcoholism, depression, drugs, whatever it may be. We tend to kind of idolize this sort of suffering artist, and we all know this image and it has been portrayed again and again through films. For example, we recreate the skewed stories of Vincent van Gogh and Frida Kahlo, just some examples of artists that are renowned for their mental illnesses. In movies like Black Swan, we have Birdman, Whiplash, and even La La Land in some ways. We can even see it in movies like Samurai Cop 2. I love Tommy Wiseau. I think he's a great actor in many ways, but even here we see this sort of suffering artist portrayal. Tommy Wiseau's character is this sort of artistic, eccentric leader of the Shinjuku clan that would do anything to protect his craft and his clan. And so all these movies tend to use this same tired, suffering artist trope as a narrative device to delve into these themes of passion, obsession, ambition, and the inevitable sacrifices that they need to have in the pursuit of artistic excellence. This image of the suffering artist, it has withheld the test of time, and it's strange because we're currently living at a wonderful time where we are discussing mental health. We are trying to destigmatize looking for help and this, these stigmas around mental health. And throughout history, this suffering artist stereotype has actually repeated itself over and over again, starting with as way back as ancient Greece. So where did this fascination come from? Why is it celebrated and why is it seen today in public conversations about mental health? More importantly, well, not more importantly, but interestingly enough, how does a Western capitalistic view of art add to the perpetuation of this trope? So I want to start off with a quote from an article I read from The Link by Megan Hunt. And so this quote says, "One of the most popular, tiresome, and dangerous tropes used to romanticize mental illness is the myth of the tortured artist. It's an idea you're already familiar with. The Sarah Kanes and Vincent van Goghs and Robin Williamses of the world were geniuses, not in spite of their mental illnesses, but because of them." Or it started with the ancient Greeks. No, just kidding, but it had to start somewhere. It started with the ancient Greeks, where it was believed that artistic genius was linked to this sort of divine madness. And we can actually trace it back to Aristotle. He was one of the first who found a link between the concept of melancholia and creative brilliance. And he actually used Hippocrates' humoral theory to show that creative people are unstable because they have black bile in them that is quite variable. And so he wasn't necessarily saying that people with creative gifts and these creative gifts are caused by mental illness, so they're all inherently mentally ill if you are creative, but he was just saying that melancholic people had melancholic tendencies. What I'm trying to say is that melancholic people were not considered really mentally ill, but many creatives had melancholic tendencies. So he wasn't really trying to perpetuate this stereotype or even create it. He just noticed this sort of overlapping. This starts to become more solidified in the Italian Renaissance. So we again see a sort of correlation between the artistic genius and suffering. The Romans even introduced a new word called genio to describe creative individuals, and this was very different to the modern word we use, genius. I'm sure you probably guessed that. Instead, it was to describe talented individuals that had this sort of way to recreate life. We'll focus more on the way this word evolved in the 18th century. We're a little bit far from that. But there were many artists, unfortunately, in the 18th century that didn't really help this cause of the suffering artist. So we talk about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who were all celebrated for their ability to recreate realistic pieces. They have these expressive pieces that people were just shocked by. They were astonished. And it was almost believed that they could only create works because they were touched by the divine. Yes. Not great. We see issues already. In the 16th century, however, we do see a pushback. Artists like Giovanni Battista Armanini argued that there is a misconception that creatives and distinctive artists need to have symptoms of eccentricity and melancholy, and so he sparked this sort of conversation. See this sort of stereotype start to dissipate in the world, and instead, well, in the Western world, we're mainly talking about Western art history right now. But he sparked this conversation. In the 7th century, we see this pull away from the suffering artists that we have now. And instead, the suffering artist trope was viewed as people who are intellectual, and they're intellectual scholars, and they're part of the social elite. So unfortunately, it's still seen that they are higher above other people. That wasn't eradicated, but at least, they're not melancholic. Artists from this era, interestingly enough, were not considered melancholic at the time. So for example, we have artists like Peter Paul Rubens, we have Rembrandt, and we consider them now to be the sort of suffering artist trope. But at that moment in the 17th century, they were just considered scholars. In the 18th century, this is where things really get solidified. We see the word genie finally get transformed into the word genius that we use today. This begins to reflect this concept of mental health struggles and creativity. So during the Romantic period, the principles shifted from the outer world to rather more complex emotional inner world. So we start getting away from the Enlightenment. We forget about that. We're like, you know what? We're not interested in that anymore. We don't see genius as spotless judgment. Now it's all about emotions, expressiveness. In imagination and creativity, we start seeing them as uncontrollable rather than a tool for sound invention. And the Romantics believed that a particular type of madness, and I'm quoting this, that a particular type of madness could characterize individuals as unique, distinguished, or even divinely selected. The connection between melancholia and creativity was reestablished. The Romantics would actually create a word for this struggle with creativity, and they named it Weltschmerz, which in German basically means a world pain, and that's the literal translation, but we can kind of call it more like an ancient pain. It's interesting, we're deviating from this a little bit, but it's kind of the same concept we see in New Age spirituality of this idea of an old soul. If you had Weltschmerz, you were seen to be an authentic genius versus just like, low-life artist. So, for example, if you think of the work of Edgar Allan Poe, very emotional, quite dark, he definitely had Weltschmerz, this sort of ancient pain, this yearning, and he was considered an authentic genius. So why did the Romantics want to redefine genius so badly? Why were they unhappy with the word genio that was created by the ancient Greeks? So during this period, there was a movement to try to get away from traditional authority. So the Enlightenment before this was all about intellect and logic and science. And the Romantics were like, there's more to life than that. We want to move away from this. And we don't want to have this traditional passive authority over the world. We want to change this definition of genius. By saying that you were run by your own imagination, you can paint yourself as a victim of your own world, which fell into the concept of danger and instability, the tempest inside you that the Romantics, in a way, worshipped. To quote a wonderful paper that I will cite later, because I can't remember what it is, I just put a number, but these two emphases paved the way to the attribution of mania from the past, while it was assuredly done with intellectual independence in the present. So the connection between genius and madness was established through removing the balance of intellectual faculties, which were generally seen in the close relationship with sanity. In the contemporary era, we start seeing people move away from this, not in the best way, however. We try to analyze this in a more, I guess, logical fashion, and we see people with psychology backgrounds attempting to address this connection of madness and creativity. In a special study done in 2012 in Sweden, this study was named Mental Illness, Suicide and Creativity, a 40-year prospective total population study. They found that patients with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, these were the two mental illnesses they focused on, their relatives are overrepresented in creative occupations. So they're trying to make this analysis that if you are descended from someone with mental illness, you automatically get this creativity. And their whole reasoning behind this was that they wanted to prove that based on Darwin's theory of evolution, people with mental health disorders, they're probably going to go, not my words, extinct. And so this comes from the idea that they're going to have lower fertility rates because of their suffering, and they're going to have higher mortality rates. Therefore, since people who suffer, I'm laughing because I just think it's a little ridiculous, they believed that there must be some sort of evolutionary advantage to having mental disorders. So it means that the idea of creativity must be an evolutionary advantage. And that means that creativity is a byproduct of mental illness, not the other way around. There have been more empirical studies done around this topic and trying to tie certain careers to psychoses and mental health disorders, but overall, there is not one systematic review of this field. I wouldn't say it's conclusive enough to say that there definitely is a connection between artists and mental health disorders, but these studies do produce a sort of positive correlation. In the end of the day, they don't analyze the big picture, they're more focusing on details, on tiny pieces of the puzzle, so it's not enough, I think, to create a conclusive theory. I would even argue to the point that creativity is part of the cure, we can call it, for many psychiatric disorders, and they were used in, and are still used in many treatments for specific subclinical mental disorders to alleviate symptoms. We start seeing more people getting help through creativity. So this begs the question that, is there a genuine correlation between creativity and what has been historically referred to as madness? Or do artists just have distinctive tools by which they can illuminate their mental health challenges? Is creativity merely an elixir to those grappling with mental health issues? That's for you to decide. So, we discussed earlier the way that the suffering artist trope is perpetuated through films, but it is also constantly used on social media, so much that I would even go as far to say that it has become an aesthetic. So please, please, please.
I don't love you anymore. Now you.
Pose with the fans. Pose with the pose with the pose with the pose with the fans. Pose with the pose with the pose with the fans.
So we can see that a lot of the times this suffering of the artist is romanticized, even today, which again is just so strange because we see this sort of paradox where we're trying to destigmatize mental health struggles, and then at the same time we have this really romanticized, idealized martyr artist suffering for their work, which clearly is not promoting healthy mental states. I think it has become an aesthetic because it is just so deeply embedded in us since it has been going on for such a long time. I think it stems from this concept of otherness. So we see the artist as something other than human. The artist is almost something that is divine, as the ancient Greeks or Romans would have said, but we don't really see them as divine. We just see them as having different talents and abilities that make them special. And so because of this, they don't need to follow the same rules as normal people in society because their genius makes up for it. So they can get away with things, and that's why they suffer. So it has to be a balance. I also have noticed that this aesthetic of the suffering artist is perpetuated by people who identify as a woman. And I would even go as far as to say that this is a gender issue as well, because if you're trying to put yourself in a different category of this suffering artist, we see this happening a lot. And we see that people are trying to make themselves as something else. So they're trying to be, I'm not that girl, I'm this girl. And we see people saying, you know, I'm the Dostoevsky girl, I'm the Kafka girl, I'm the whatever it may be, Sylvia Plath girl. I think it has to do with that of trying to deviate from the patriarchal mold of woman that is instilled within all of us and to become different. And so that way, even if I am a suffering artist, at least I'm not the blueprint. So at least I'm something else. I'm not the typical girl that is perpetuated by the patriarchy. So in a way, you're the mysterious girl. You're the Bella Swan of the art world. Again, this topic of the suffering artist trope is still preserved in schools, and I can even talk about this. So I was in art school not too long ago, 2018, 2019, and I was having a meeting with my professor, and we were discussing going forward with my education, and I was considering doing an MFA, which is a Master of Fine Arts. Emotional support. But I actually had the discussion with this professor, and they were saying that if I ever wanted to be a good and professional artist, I would basically have to isolate myself and just devote my life to my work. And they told me that I wouldn't be able to have a family, I wouldn't be able to get married, I wouldn't be able to have children. Even living with people would hinder my artistic development. I would basically just need total isolation and not have a life. And they said this with a very serious face. This is the way it's meant to be. Hey, you have no life. You have to sit here every day. That's just the way it is, and you just have to deal with it. I think it's a bit insane to be able to tell that and be comfortable telling that to a young girl who is just excited and striving for their dreams. So to that professor, a very personal go to hell. And if anyone else believes that with artists, you're part of the problem. Anyways. Before the 1960s, artists were more independent, so they worked in their own studios. Yes, they did have people, the elites, coming in from higher classes to look at their artwork and to see where their art progression was going. At the same time, they were overall quite independent. In the 1960s is where things really started to change, so we start seeing this rise of the individual, and many artists begin to adopt a more capitalistic manner of producing artwork. The studios started becoming more like factories where you would stamp out artworks. There was more of a focus on the means of production rather than the quality of production. So quantity over quality. Some artists even went as far as to hire other people to make artwork for them. So among these artists, to give out some names, some idea people were Andy Warhol, Jeff Koons, and Frank Stella. Of course, there is sense to this because more production means you have more artwork, which means you have more to market to other people. Marketing specialists start coming in, auctioneers, luxury good manufacturers. You start raking in more dough. Eventually, this model became a more central part of the art market. It slowly turned into the idea that if you want to become a great artist who also makes a great deal of money, you need to focus on putting your art on a production line. If you want to be in big galleries and auctions and the top museums, you basically just have to market to what they're looking for. If you don't, you can make artwork that is from the heart, so it's considered more genuine. You don't get to follow anyone's rules. You're not run by or motivated by the question, what can I do to maximize this art's market value? But you're stuck as an outcast. So it's this weird dichotomy between the insider and the outsider. Again, we have this concept of otherness. If you're an outsider, yes, your work is genuine, you don't make the big bucks, you aren't at big galleries, but hey, you're expressing yourself. Good for you. And because of this, you are struggling. And because most likely you're not making a lot of money, people aren't as interested in your artwork because it's not the industry market norm. You're struggling to buy necessities and live a normal basic life, which obviously is going to cause suffering and most likely mental health struggles. I mean, let's not even talk about how outrageously expensive art supplies are. At the end of the day, it just seems like currently and starting from the 1960s, if you want to be commercially viable, you need to sell yourself out in one way or the other, which also starts to reinforce that struggling artist stereotype, because you're basically damned if you do. You can't create genuine work, you have to follow the market, or you're damned if you don't because you are suffering and not being able to have your own art world. You have to focus on expressing yourself, but you're never going to get into those big museums, etc. Going back to the article that I mentioned at the beginning of this, the connection here is simple. Art can rarely be both a psychological reprieve and a form of labor. And in our current burnout culture, the latter is unavoidable. We live in a society that expects to monetize everything, to view our most precious creations and life-altering breakthroughs as potential revenue streams. Art under capitalism is labor, and labor is something to exhaust, not enlighten. I'm not trying to say that capitalism in the art world is all bad and it has ruined art for everyone. In many ways, it also has allowed many artists to be independent. They don't need to sacrifice and stifle their creative expressions to be independent. There are many successful artists that don't follow the galleries and auctions route, and instead they work for themselves. However, to support this lifestyle, it's not a normal 9-to-5 job. You have many artists working over 16 hours a day to support their lifestyle, and they need to produce an extortionate amount of artwork to just be able to stay financially afloat. This is a one-man job. Most artists don't have enough money to be able to hire other people to help them. So you're doing all the jobs in one. You are the photographer, you are the painter, you are the creator, you are the marketing manager, you are the sales manager, so on and so forth.
God. Oh my 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 god.
Hey, freak show! You're going nowhere! I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes of playtime!
Of course, if you're struggling to make ends meet, this is going to perpetuate the struggling artist stereotype because your mental health is inevitably going to suffer. So we really do need a balance that values artistic expression alongside financial success. There are, however, initiatives aimed at supporting artists' mental health, so I don't want this just to be bashing this concept, because due to the widespread movement of highlighting and destigmatizing mental health struggles, we are seeing more initiatives. More and more galleries and magazines are focusing on specifically supporting artists who struggle with mental health issues. For example, I recently got published in a journal called The Shallot, which is the Shallot Journal of Mental Health, Art and Literature, and they really made an effort to take artists who suffer with mental health struggles and vouch for them. Moreover, more and more funds and grants are being available for artists, especially when artists are first starting out, so that way they can create more authentic work, be more financially stable without worrying about everything else, so they can really just focus on their work. Of course, this is not available to everyone, and this beckons the question of privilege. That's a whole other discussion. But I guess they're trying. Online platforms as well are booming, and they're offering direct artist to buyer connections, which is really, really important. Of course, again, the impact of this is debatable. We have platforms like Etsy, which some people believe that are also perpetuating the sort of capitalistic model of art, but at least in some ways, these platforms are allowing artists to directly interact with their art community, which was never, of course, seen before. One of the most important initiatives I think that has come out of the struggling artist stereotype is the career of an art therapist. It's not as popular, I think, worldwide, but I've definitely seen a rise in the US. There is definitely no doubt that creativity has a positive and perhaps even sort of healing impact on those suffering with mental health problems. So seeing the career as an art therapist can help destigmatize the suffering artist trope, because they're showing creativity as something that is beneficial, not a product of suffering. So how can we break free from the suffering artist stereotype while valuing both artistic expression and financial success in a world that is so deeply connected to capitalism? Is the suffering artist something inherent in a creative person, And should this concept be embraced or should it be challenged? Personally, I believe that the suffering artist stereotype is a myth. Is something that has been rooted in history and perpetuated over the ages so long and so deep that it just becomes natural. But it's not natural. Suffering is not natural. It's basically like a loophole for others to tell you that this is the way it is and you need to struggle and ignore the way that poverty impacts us. And of course, in a way, it is also ableist, because basically saying that all creative people are mentally ill is quite a statement. I think in general, for many of us, we were exposed, who aren't artists, we were exposed to art and we see artists and creativity as something otherworldly because they're like a magician. We ooh and ah at their creations because they go into a room, then they come out with this amazing work. And we don't know how it was done. We don't really see how it was created. Thankfully, with social media, we start seeing more videos of people posting and showing their process, so it's no longer this sort of mysterious magical act of artists just creating artwork out of nowhere and people taking it for granted. We weren't subjected as much to looking into a hole in the room and seeing how much the artist has to work and how much time they have to spend on creating artwork and getting better at it. We idealize the artist, we see them as being touched by something unknown, and therefore this ingrained suffering artist stereotype comes into play. They suffer because of their gift, and therefore that makes it okay. And obviously you don't need a study to understand that if you are struggling with mental health, you aren't going to produce as much and as great of a work as you would be if your mind is clear. Those with mental health struggles, they struggle with simple daily tasks, and I can vouch for this as well. Why do we have this weird vision that if you are a mentally ill artist, you can barely function, but at least, hey, you can pick up a paintbrush and you can create this amazing genius work? Like, obviously not. Can't birth a masterpiece from suffering. And even though we have these sort of martyrs, Vincent van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, Amy Winehouse, the list goes on and on. But at the end of the day, their artwork would have been way better if they had the help they needed. Yes, they created amazing works, but those are just drops in the ocean compared to what could have been. I also wanted to add a famous quote from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where she says, "She will write in rage where she should write calmly. She will write foolishly when she should write wisely. She will write of herself where she should write of her characters. She is at war with her lot." Woolf wrote this about Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, and she was trying to say that she had more genius, quote unquote, than Jane Austen. And the reason was, instead of writing about her characters, she was so tormented by her anger towards the inequality, the injustice, the lack of education that women had during that time, that it affected her writing so much that she wrote about herself instead. Of course, this is centered more about women writers and women artists and the suffering that they had to gone through. But it beckons the question that what would have been different if this anger wasn't present, if these injustices weren't present, if this myth of the suffering artist wasn't so perpetuated. And so saying all this, I don't want it to come across that artists who struggle with mental health should just stay silent. They should never speak about this or incorporate these challenges into their work. That's not what I'm saying. I just want to encourage artists to challenge this stereotype rather than romanticize it, and just be mindful of the way it comes across when you are talking about it. So most importantly, supporting other artists in the community and reminding them that even though recovery is tough and often unpleasant, it makes us all better. So that is all that I have to add. I want to say thank you for watching. This is, of course, my first video essay that I've done. I want to see how I did. I want you to tell me how I did. And I want to hear your thoughts on this concept of the suffering artist trope. So, of course, leave a comment, show this to your friends, show this to your mom, show this to your artist friends. Tell them about the suffering artist stereotype. And most importantly, support those around you, be safe, and have a good day.